Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments, such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org.
Local news, fire alerts, music that brings us together. Boise State Public Radio is not optional, it's essential. But after the Senate cut off federal support, we are facing a serious funding shortfall. Your gift today helps keep this free local service on the air for everyone in every corner of Idaho. You can go to boisestatepublicradio.org and donate now.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Samantha Wright, filling in for Gemma Gaudette, and this is Idaho Matters. We talk a lot on this show about cheatgrass, how this invasive weed kills native plants, takes over the land, especially after wildfires. And we've talked to a lot of people who are trying to stop its spread. But, we never really talk about where cheatgrass comes from and how did it get here to Idaho? Turns out, in the 19th century, as settlers took their cattle cars out to the American West on trains, an uninvited passenger hitched a ride. You guessed it, it was cheatgrass. Since then, it sparked an ecological nightmare, fueling wildfires, pushing out native species, and creating economic burdens, especially here in Idaho. Boise State professor Stephen Novak studies hundreds of kinds of cheatgrasses, and has been tracking their spread from one continent to another. He's here to shed a little light on this nasty weed. Hi, Stephen. How you doing today?
Good, Samantha. Thank you for having me on the show. I'm a longtime listener and a sustaining member of Boise State Public Radio.
Oh my gosh, we'd love to hear that. That is awesome. Okay, start at the beginning. What is cheatgrass? We talk about it all the time, but is it a grass? Is it a weed? Is it both? What is it?
Well, it's definitely a grass. It's in the grass family. Weed is kind of not a technical botanical term because mostly it's a value judgment of humans. So you might say, what defines a weed? It's any plant in the wrong place at the wrong time. So it's definitely weedy, but it's definitely a grass also. It can be both. And in fact, it's a weed even in its native range. Its native range is enormous across much of Eurasia, starting in like the Iberian Peninsula, so Portugal and Spain, Morocco, all the way across the northern rim of Africa and into Central Asia. I've collected plants in northwestern China. So it just has an enormous geographic range in its native range.
Well, okay, for anyone who hasn't seen cheatgrass, and I've grown up around cheatgrass, I know what it looks like, but not everybody has. So describe it. What does it look like?
So it varies in what it looks like. But one thing that really characterizes it is right now when plants are full of seeds, it has this where the plant produces the seeds. It droops downward because of the weight of the seed. So it has these side branches where the flowers are, but then they turn into seeds. So that's one way I always think about it in terms of it's a drooping down full of seeds. Now, I mean, there's probably a lot of plants that do that. And it's an annual grass. So sometimes there might only be one flowering stem. But in really good situations, I've seen one plant that has over 20 different stems that it shoots up and all carrying, 100 seeds or more.
Okay, wow. And I think of cheatgrass as cheatgrass, like a single thing. But I was looking at your research, and you have studied literally hundreds of kinds of cheatgrasses. How many are there?
Hundreds of populations of cheatgrass.
Yeah, that are all over and that are in different places. And we hear about the Genome Project where you try and track where people are and where they've come from. You've been doing that with cheatgrass. I mean, you've been tracking it from where it was to where it is.
That's right. So we first, as a graduate student at Washington State, go Cougs. Um, uh, I started working on cheatgrass in the 80s. I was using a technique that wouldn't be called genomics, a much older technique. And of course, we first started analyzing populations locally. We didn't find a lot of genetic diversity.
Hmm.
So we started expanding outward so that, one chapter in my dissertation involved like the analysis of 60 populations of cheatgrass across the United States, including, well, and parts of Canada, especially British Columbia. But then we also got a hold of populations from its native range, and we were able to compare the genetic diversity of native populations with the genotypes in invasive populations.
Okay, so you just mentioned, looking at 60 different types, and you tracked some from the East Coast in the 1800s, and then they came to Idaho. Now, I mentioned trains. Can we talk about the trains first? But there may be other ways they got to the West.
Sure. I mean, when people were, sort of building the railroad system, the transcontinental railroad system, of course, they started transporting all sorts of goods, including livestock, and their bedding in livestock cars probably was infested with cheatgrass seeds. And at different stops, they'd unload, soiled bedding and place new stuff in. And probably, if cheatgrass was a contaminant, that we're moving it across the country.
Oh man. And they just
And
throw it out, at every stop, right? Or even in between. And then there's another chunk of cheatgrass seeds.
exactly. And you might think, oh, that seems like rather inhospitable territory, like, along or near railroad tracks. But in a collecting trip back east, by the way, I should say that cheatgrass occurs in every state in the United States in terms of permanent populations, except for Florida. It has been collected in Florida. And when I was collecting back east, one place to typically find cheatgrass was along railroad right-of-ways. You have all that cobbly stone. Even if there's a lot of
Oh.
precipitation, it just, filters down through the stone. So it's kind of a drier environment that cheatgrass can tolerate and other plants can't. So railroads are important not only as a way to spread it, but also as a kind of habitat in certain areas. We also believe, like in earlier than the railroads, canal systems in the East and Midwest were another source by which it probably spread.
Wow, that's just incredible to think about. Um, we're speaking with Stephen Novak, a Boise State University biology professor, about cheatgrass and how it got to Idaho. You also, I learned from you how cheatgrass got its name. How did cheatgrass become cheatgrass?
Well, the one story that's most often told, and I'm going to say I believe it, is is apparently unscrupulous grain merchants in the 1800s, and I think one place that's cited where this occurred is around Walla Walla, Washington. Unscrupulous grain merchants would sell you a bag of wheat seed, but because they were unscrupulous, they'd actually take out 5 or 10 pounds of wheat seed and put in 5 or 10 pounds of cheatgrass seed. And people would just sow the seed. And when the plants are really young, they look virtually identical.
Ah.
So if you're looking out at a wheat field, you think, oh, I have a nice crop going on. But then once they reproduce and they send up their inflorescence where they produce the flowers and will produce grain or seeds, then you realize, oh my God, that's not just wheat. This plant, what's it doing in my fields? I've been cheated. And thus the name cheatgrass.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Okay, I'm going to dub you the king of cheatgrass because you have done so much research on this plant and its variations. You mentioned along how it kind of likes to be in those areas along the railroads. Why is it such a successful invasive species? Is it adapting to new areas? Does it adapt well?
It might be adapting to new areas. One thing that's probably occurring with cheatgrass right now is Samantha, here's an interesting tidbit of information. In Western North America, the grass was first seen in 1889 in Spence's Bridge, British Columbia.
Hmm.
And then it was seen like almost simultaneously in other places soon thereafter. One pre-1900 sighting of cheatgrass is actually just south of Boise, Idaho.
Oh, wow.
So it was probably introduced into multiple locations almost simultaneously. But the first time it was ever seen was in 1889. But by 1930, it had the geographic distribution that it currently holds. So that means within about 40 years, the plants spread to move across interior British Columbia and western North America. That's phenomenal. And multiple introductions probably helped it spread so fast. Another factor is it's a highly selfing plant. So it engages in sexual reproduction, but the pollen fertilizes a little flower. So it selfs or is self-pollinating, which means that it doesn't need a mate. It's always going to produce seeds, and it's always going to produce a lot of seeds. And it has high phenotypic plasticity. Phenotypic plasticity means it has different morphological appearances. If you hold genotypes constant and grow them in different environments, it'll survive and reproduce, but it'll look different. So it has this ability to not adapt, but to conform to different environments and survive. And it did that, it does that in its native range. It was a weed in its native range. And so it's just filling that same niche here. At the time it was introduced, there was a tremendous amount of overgrazing, so damage to the native vegetation. Cheatgrass filled those damaged areas.
Mm.
And of course, as you mentioned, altered the fire regime here. So
Yeah.
now the fires are more intense and larger. There's essentially destroying the native vegetation. And who are the plants that survive or prosper after that? Well, it's cheatgrass and other invasive plants that have been introduced.
Okay, we know how bad cheatgrass is, and you're telling me it's a weed, even where it came from. Is there anything cheatgrass is good for? Is there any positive effect to cheatgrass?
Well, one time I was on a little trip with somebody from the Simplot livestock company, and I said to him, "Oh, cheatgrass, that's just worthless stuff, isn't it? It must be your bane." And he was like, "Oh no, early spring forage, nothing like it."
Hmm.
So well, one, it can seeds germinate like almost all throughout the winter if the temperatures are appropriate, but the bulk of germination occurs in the fall. The plants grow, they overwinter, they're still green, especially if they get covered with snow. They're a little insulated from conditions. And then once the snow is removed, like it leaves, oh man, it's the first thing to green up. So livestock, cattle will eat it initially because the native grasses that it might prefer actually aren't greened up yet. But the problem is, of course, those seeds that everyone hates, that gets in your socks or in your dog's fur, can cause puncture wounds in cattle, and that can harm the cattle. One of my first collecting trips, I bumped into a veterinarian in Burns, Oregon, and he talked about how cattle have died because they get puncture wounds in their stomach and they ulcerate and ultimately kill the cow. So early spring forage, apparently it's good for that.
Wow. And I believe that. It used to get in my dog's ear, and you can't get it out. It just
It
burrows.
It gets everywhere, doesn't it? And so you called me what, the king of cheatgrass? That's a dubious distinction. If you think about how many socks you have to throw out and
Oh
pulling
my
it out
gosh.
of
Oh, it's
your
everywhere.
dog's fur, ears,
It's
whatever.
everywhere. Okay, we got about 3 minutes left. Can we get rid of this? Is it even possible to get rid of cheatgrass? And what are we
Uh,
trying to do to keep it down?
well, it's now just such a tremendous landscape level problem. It seems hard to conceive of how it can be controlled. many agencies, both state and federal, have tried many different strategies. And of course, we still have a cheatgrass problem. So I and some of my papers have advocated that the one thing that might be successful with such a problem is classic biological control. That is finding something in the native range of cheatgrass that attacks it, that would be studied so that, it wouldn't switch hosts.
Mm.
And this process can take, like, once you identify a biological control agent, it might take 8 or 10 years before it's ever deployed. Because, of course, it's a grass, so is wheat, so is barley, so rice. So we don't have a lot of rice here, but you can see where you don't want it to switch. So that seems to me like the best hope, and people have been looking for a biological control agent. It's just very tough to do with grasses, especially annual grasses, because they don't have like specific insects that might attack them, because they don't really have complex chemistry that those insects in the native range would have evolved like a strategy for overcoming the toxins. So it's just a tough problem, but fungal pathogens have been used to control other grasses, and that might be a route to try and control cheatgrass. I mean, just think about the enormous number of acres filled with cheatgrass.
Ugh.
Obviously, there's just not enough money and herbicide in the world to spray all over the place to try and kill cheatgrass.
Yeah.
And then, of course, if you're spraying that much herbicide, I mean, what are the environmental impacts of just all that herbicide application?
Oh, man.
Fire can help, but one thing that cheatgrass is really good at is not only produces a lot of seeds, the seeds can survive in the soil seed bank for something like 8 or 10 years.
Wow.
So there's always going to be this reservoir of seeds that you have to actually outlast if you're trying to get rid of the cheatgrass.
Oh, my gosh. Okay, we've been speaking with Stephen Novak, a Boise State University biology professor, about the invasion of cheatgrass across the West. Stephen, thanks for giving us a little insight into this nasty little plant.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to Idaho Matters from Boise State Public Radio. I'm Gemma Gaudette.
These days, there's so much news, it can be hard to keep up with what it all means for you, your family, and your community. The Consider This podcast from NPR features our award-winning journalism. 6 days a week, we bring you a deep dive on a news story and provide the context and analysis that helps you make sense of the news. We get behind the headlines. We get to the truth. Listen to the Consider This podcast from NPR.